to discuss pertinent issues in Kenya's economy, to carry out research and public education, and to try to make the results of that research and those discussions available to government and decision makers so that there are alternative choices that might be taken. One of the most important things that happened last year, apart from the global pandemic, of course, the broad coverage about COVID-19, was that the formal introduction of the African Continental Free Trade Area came into force. And while, of course, it was postponed for a while, but basically 2020 was, quote unquote, the D-Day for the AfTA, as we all call it. Now, the AfTA as it exists, I think, is not a single free trade area. The logic of free trade areas is accepted by many people, not less by the Institute of Economic Affairs, because our belief is that the wider the free trade area, the more specialization takes place, the greater the ability, the larger the markets, the greater the efficiencies that can be created for firms, and more effectively, the provision of goods and services that may be made available to citizens or consumers. So that logic of, classical logic of larger markets and cross-border trade is acceptable. However, the AfTA is built on, if I may say, on the foundations of existing regional economic blocs and some bilateral treaties that exist on the continent. So we have a lot of bilateral, treaties that exist on the continent. We have the regional blocs, starting with the East African Community, the Western Africa. Western Africa, we have treaties in Central Africa, and obviously we have the SADC and COMESA. So all these came together, already had existing institutional structures, which would have to be reconciled or at least made consistent with what AfTA would be. Many of them have more elaborate institutions, and therefore AfTA would simply be an addition. Now that creates both challenges and opportunities. And one of the areas in which challenges and opportunities would arise is the existence of competition or competition authorities. So competition laws exist and competition policies exist nearly in every one of those. So if you start within the East African Community where Kenya and partner states are based, there's the East African competition laws and policy. Then at the COMESA level, there are other competition laws and policies, each of the others all the way from West Africa, coming down to ECOWAS in West Africa and coming down to the SADC. All of these have existing competition policies and arrangements, whether they're in formalized written form or whether they're in practice. Now, the IEA has a regulation and trade program, two problems, economic regulation and trade programs. So they saw the convergence of these. And one of the things that we did was in response to a call to write analytical papers. Two of my colleagues, together with others, led in writing a paper, which is the subject of our discussion today. And among the questions they asked themselves is that given the fact that there are all these different competition policy institutional arrangements, what does this mean for AfTA? What is the best way to build one that is one, coherent, effective, and stable within the African continent, starting with existing arrangements and trying to reconcile them with each other, because that creates a very complex background upon which laws ought to be built, laws and institutional structures ought to be built. So what we have is this webinar today is to discuss, and the topic is designing an AfTA-driven continent-wide competition policy around the regional economic communities. Remember that the regional economic communities preceded AfTA, and for that reason, they're the building blocks upon which AfTA is constructed. It makes sense, therefore, and that's the assumption of everybody, that the reconciliation, both vertically and horizontally, with AfTA is essential for these regional economic, or rather for the competition policies and laws that exist. So my two colleagues, Melody and Fiona, presented an article which was published a couple of weeks back. And in trying to circulate this article, there's a demand by the members of the IEA, but the audience that follows us, for us to hold and actually discuss the content. So we'll provide a link to the article itself, but we have an early opportunity today for my colleagues to present what the findings are and some of the conclusions that they do. So I'll have my colleague, Melody Njeru, who's the program officer in our program on international trade and development to make the introduction of the paper, and she'll speak for 20 minutes. The introduction, taking us to AfCFTA's competition policy provisions and competition framework proposals. And she'll be followed thereafter by Fiona, who's a research officer, assistant program officer in our economic regulation program. We'll be discussing the main regional blocks, trying to put together what the regional blocks are, the content of the policies, of the competition policies, and some of the challenges affecting trade and competition in Africa. And Melody will conclude. So we'll hope that the entire presentation of this elaborate paper will not take more than 40 minutes, and then we'll have a plenary session in which we'll open up to a question and answer. So just before I hand over to my colleagues, I'd like to just commit us to 2 rules. One, first, please switch off, please keep your mics muted during the presentation together with your cameras. So that's the first. Secondly, I'd like to warn you that this session is being recorded, and the only reason for the recording is to enable us to actually make it available to other audiences. So it will be edited and placed on our social media pages, more specifically in YouTube channel. So if you do not wish to appear in that, please let us know, and you can ask your questions by simply sending it through the chat box. There's a chat box which has a bubble, and will provide an opportunity to ask questions as the presentations go along. So you can send any questions through the chat box. And then as soon as my colleagues are done in 40 minutes, I'll come back to the audience and I'll allow you to ask questions, to field questions to them, which they shall answer, and hope that we can conclude by 11:30 today. So welcome, Melody. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Melody Njeru, a program officer at the Institute of Economic Affairs, working with the International Trade and Development Program. As Kwame has explained, we did a research on designing a continent-wide competition policy paper, and we wanted to see what will be the requirements and what lessons can we learn from regional economic communities. So on to introduction. We have an outline. Next slide, please. This is our outline. I'll talk on the introduction, study objectives, methodology, and also some literature review on the competition law and competition policy. Then I'll take you through also the AfCFTA competition policy provisions. Then my colleague will take over. So study objectives. The main objective of the study was to determine priority areas that will be considered when negotiating the AfCFTA competition policy paper using lessons learned from RECs. We specifically looked at 4 RECs, that is COMESA, ECOWAS, EAC, and SADC, because they are at a deeper level of integration. They also have some form of competition authority and regulation, and also they also form part of the biggest regional economic communities in Africa. We also wanted to identify challenges affecting trade and fair competition in Africa, and also look at proposals that we can give for the competition framework that will be discussed in the second round of negotiations of the AfCFTA. Our methodology was mainly through desk research, desk review, and also analysis of secondary data. We analyzed the AfCFTA agreement and also looked at policy documents from the 4 RECs, that is COMESA, ECOWAS, EAC, SADC, and did some analysis that my colleague will take you through later. So for us to be on the same page, we needed to define what competition is, what is competition law, and also what is competition policy. From the World Bank's definition, it defines competition as a situation where firms or sellers independently strive for buyers' patronage to achieve a particular business objective. That is, it could be they want to achieve sales, profits, or market share. G. Stigler, one of the renowned economists and also a Nobel laureate, defines competition as a rivalry between individuals or group of nations, and it arises when 2 or more parties strive for something that all cannot obtain. Professor Clark, who's also a renowned competition economist and also the pioneer of the workable or effective competition, defines it as a combination of factors that stimulated economic rivalry. Then he further described as a kind of market pressure, which must be exerted to penalize laggards and to reward the enterprising and in the way promote economic progress. So in a nutshell, competition is equated with rivalry that takes place between firms or nations or individuals, and it is in form of either price, quality, service, or combination of all these factors. When we come to competition policy is a subset of competition, and some definitions that we've got is government measures that directly affect the behavior of enterprises and structure of industry, that is the regulation bit. And also competition policy works hand in hand with trade liberalization and regulatory reform, in that trade policy eliminates tariff and non-tariff barriers, while the regulatory reform eliminates domestic regulation that restricts entry and exit, while competition policy targets business conduct that limits market access and reduces actual and potential competition. So in a nutshell, trade policy looks at the regulation environment where the government is mainly involved, also the regulatory reform. Meanwhile, the competition policy mainly targets individuals, businesses, and regulations that mainly target businesses, individuals, and also firms or even nations. When we come to competition law, in other jurisdictions, also known as antitrust or anti-monopoly law, it is a subset of competition policy and is the legal enactment designed to prevent anti-competitive business practices by firms and unnecessary government intervention in the marketplace. So these are the specific laws that are put in place to bring the legal framework in place on competition. And in most jurisdictions, competition laws also are supported by an institutional structure that will enforce and also preserve and promote competitive rivalry. And it's in competition laws where we get the competition authorities. Like in Kenya, we have the Competition Authority of Kenya that was established by the Competition Act number 12 of 2010. So once you've put that foundation on what is competition policy, and what is competition law, we looked at the AfCFTA agreement. Just a brief overview of the agreement is that it came into force on 30th May 2019. This is after the minimum threshold was met, whereby 22 countries deposited their instruments of ratification with the chairperson of the AU Commission. But so far, 54 union member states have signed the agreement, apart from Eritrea. As at 30th of September 2021, 38 countries have deposited the instruments of ratification, while 41 countries have complied with their domestic requirements for ratification of the AfCFTA. So the overarching objective of AfCFTA is to have a continent-wide single market for goods and services, while allowing free movement of both capital and persons. Once this AfCFTA agreement is in full implementation, it will be the largest free trade area in the world, having a market of about 1.2 billion people. So in the AfCFTA agreement, we have some provisions. We have principles, and these principles have an effect on the competition policy, in that they will either slow down the pace of competition reforms or they will hasten the pace of competition reforms. The first principle is driven by member states. This is the member states are the highest decision-making organ of AfCFTA, and decisions made at this level are binding to all state parties, including negotiations on the competition protocol. So at this level, competition reforms will be dependent on the pace in which individual member states will ratify, assent, and implement agreements that are agreed on, like the competition policy protocol. So considering the pace in which the AfCFTA also agreements was integrated and also signed by the different countries, we saw it was such a slow pace, and considering that now that this competition policy protocol will also be driven by member states, there is a risk whereby it may slow down the process because different member states are at different levels when it comes to competition, in terms of having competition laws, competition policies, or competition authorities, and they might slow down, or they might have protectionism principles that might make them not integrate faster to the protocols that have been agreed upon. So there is a risk in which having the member states, there's the positive bit where the member states are able to, the decisions made at the member states level is binding to all state parties, but the risk is that the slow pace of integration may make the competition policy protocol not easily integrated by everyone. Then the second principle is regional economic communities, free trade area as the building blocks of AfCFTA. We have 8 main regional economic communities, and as we focused on the 4, ECOWAS, EAC, COMESA, and SADC, because them they're at a deeper level of integration. They have laws in place. Some have laws, others have an authority, others have regulations in place. But we have the other RECs where they've not had any form of free trade areas. They've not formed any form of free trade areas, which is required for trade liberalization. And also, there's no specific clause in the AfCFTA that talks about the specific plans on how to address the disparities between the RECs. So when we have different levels of integration and the RECs are the building blocks of the AfCFTA, it means that successive negotiations will have to be deliberately carried out, and also it may take a lot of time for the people who are a bit behind to come into the levels at which these other RECs are in. So there's the positive bit where they're not starting from scratch. There's some lessons that they can be learned, but at the same time, we have the issues of we'll need to have successive round of negotiations to bring everyone on the table. And then another issue with the RECs is that some member states have overlapping memberships, multiple and overlapping memberships. If I'm to give an example of Tanzania, it's a member of EAC, it's a member of SADC, it's a member of COMESA, and all these 3 bodies have a form of competition regulation in place. So because of this, the overlapping membership, it leads to complexity and also lacks of enforcement and uncertainty on how implementation of certain laws will take place. So in practice, this has led to less trade liberalization among member countries, but at the same time, it will also lead to a lot of clashes between the conflict of laws between the different member states and also the REC. So there's a lot of successive rounds of negotiations that will have to take place for us to have a continent-wide competition policy. As for variable geometry, it's a negotiation strategy that accommodates differences in views among nations, such that the agreement is not binding to all parties to the agreement. This is one of the negotiation strategies that the AfCFTA adopted. That's why member states of African Union were able to join and also to sign the agreement at different stages. And because of that, we will have a lax also to also slow down the pace of adoption of competition policy. Because if you give room for members to have time to look at the agreement and it's not binding, we'll have like different opinions, and also not everyone will be on board. Therefore, we won't be able to get the objectives of the having a continent-wide competition policy. Next. The next one is on flexibility and special differential treatment. These are special provisions that can include longer periods of implementing agreements and commitments and measures to improve trading opportunities for least developed countries. At least this is a good thing, because knowing that different countries at different levels of having the competition regulations in place, having provisions that will help the least developed countries to take their time and also to facilitate their smooth integration will enable everyone it will enable all member states to come on board without any issues. The next one is transparency and disclosure of information, a very crucial clause when it comes to competition policy. And this, of course, will help to the effectiveness of implementation of a continent-wide competition regulation. The next one, we have the preservation of acquis. State parties that are members of the RECs that have attained higher levels of integration shall maintain such higher levels among themselves. This is set out in Article 19 of the AfCFTA agreement. And this has both good sides and bad sides, in that the good side is that it will be a stepping stone for competition reforms, thereby speeding up the process. But the challenge here will be harmonizing what has been achieved by the various RECs. And also we know that different member states have heterogeneous interests, and therefore having to bring everyone on board to integrate, yet at the same point, at the same time, we are telling people that you will maintain whatever you have already accomplished so far. It will bring some level of conflict among member states and also among the regional economic communities. So a lot of negotiations will have to take place considering this clause of this principle of the AfCFTA agreement. Then we have the most favored nation. This operates differently from the traditional MFN clauses, in that the application is not unconditional or automatic. Rather, states can only receive MFN rates on reciprocal basis. It is not automatic. Therefore, the absence of the traditional MFN clause serves a different purpose, namely the previous principle that we've seen, to preserve the acquis, where whatever accomplishment that the RECs have achieved will be maintained. So the risk herein is that herein is the creation of laws and policies that will differ across the state parties, thereby inhibiting fast uptake of continental competition reforms. National treatment is a principle that states that parties may not discriminate against important products in the domestic market simply because they are from a different area. So of course, this will give a level playing field for all products in the market, thus necessitating expeditious competition reforms. This will enable the fast uptake of the clause. Then we have reciprocity. This is the implementation of the reciprocity principle will result in liberalization of markets, thus oblige state parties to initiate continental competition reforms, meaning that it will hasten the process and also make member states to be more deliberate about coming up with the continental competition reforms. The second last one is the consensus in decision making. At the continental level, it is expected that the bureaucracy that has been generated by AfCFTA's institutional framework will further stagnate the negotiation process. This is because the AfCFTA has an institutional structure where we have different levels of decision making. At the highest level is the member states. As we've seen, the first principle is driven by the member states. Then we have another level where we'll have the ministers of trade having decision making. Then we'll have the different committees. Therefore, before one committee makes the decisions and moves to the next, before it is adopted by the member states, it will take a lot of time and therefore stagnate the negotiation process, considering all the other challenges and hurdles that may face during the negotiations. So this will have to be closely looked at and see how the bureaucracy that has been generated by the institutional framework can be handled to enable fast pace competition reforms. Then the last one is best practices in RECs in the state parties and international conventions binding the AU, considering that we've said time and again that the RECs are at different levels of integration, with some having made great strides, having competition authorities in place. It's so easy to get the lessons from these best practice from these RECs and also integrate it to the continental competition reforms. So that is basically the principles of AfCFTA. AfCFTA, as much as competition policy will happen during the second round of negotiations, it has some provisions here and there that are related to competition. The first one is on conflict and conflict resolution powers, which is a very important aspect of competition regulation. Article 20 of the AfCFTA establishes the dispute resolution mechanism that shall be administered in accordance with the protocol on rules and procedures on the settlement of the dispute. So there's this mechanism, which is a body that has been established by the AfCFTA agreement, and part of the procedures in which the body will perform is documented in Article 2 of the Protocol on Rules and Procedures, and it sets the principles of this mechanism to be transparent, accountable, fair, consistent, and predictable. So that's the first provision that we have. The second one is on monopoly practice. Article 11 of AfCFTA Protocol on Trade in Services concerns monopolies and exclusive supplies. Clause 1 of the article obliges states parties to adhere to national monopoly laws and the AfCFTA agreement. So AfCFTA acknowledges that different member states already have national laws on competition and also monopoly. And then the state also is obliged to ensure that the suppliers do not act outside the specific monopoly rights. Should a state wish to grant monopoly rights to a supplier after the agreement has come into force, these intentions must be communicated to the Secretariat not later than 3 months before the intended implementation of the grants. Therefore, it gives just a brief framework on how monopoly practice will be carried out in the trade in services area. And the last one, the AfCFTA agreement talks on restrictive practices, which is also found in the Protocol on Trade in Services. Article 12 of the Trade in Services Protocol addresses the anti-competitive business practices. Outlined in 2 clauses, they provide provisions that require states to address restrictive practices within its jurisdiction in cooperation with complainant states by releasing information about restrictive practices and resolving complaints to a satisfactory conclusion. When you read the article, it gives just a brief procedures on how this will be carried out. So from there, my colleague Fiona will take over and take us through the main regional blocks.
Okay, thank you, Mel. So my name is Fiona Okadia, and I work under the Economic Competition and Regulation. I'm going to take you through the analysis of the main regional blocks, policies, and principles. So in Africa, we have 8 regional economic communities. So this is Aghreb, then you have COMESA, you have CENSAD, EAC, ECAS, ECOWAS, IGAD, and SADC. So again, we focused on only 4 RECs because of the fact that they had deeper integration, and then we also looked at other factors such as population. We looked at also their size and that. So Now, in an effort to deepen economic integration and also liberalize trade, you have the members of the African Union who came together and adopted the AfCFTA agreement. So for its full implementation, they had set up various protocols that were going to help them. So this is trade in goods, then you have trade in services, you have rules and procedures on settlements of disputes, you have investment, intellectual property, and competition policy. So for the second phase of negotiations, what they have not yet discussed is the competition policy, the IP and investment, which are now expected to take place. So competition policy is very important for AfCFTA because it's what will determine it. But then if you look at the African competition framework, it's still a fairly new concept. And this is because you have so which have both a competition law and also a competition authority in place. So these are countries such as Kenya, Tanzania, you have Cameroon, Egypt, just to state a few examples. And then you have 13 countries in total that just have a competition law in place, but they don't have a competition authority. So these are Rwanda, Sudan, you have Niger as well, and then you have 17 countries in total that have no competition law in place, or they're in the early stages of preparing one, such as Libya, you have Uganda, and Chad. So if you look at this table, basically it just shows that fall under the four analysis. So for COMESA that has 19, and then you have ECOWAS that has 15. So, and then additionally, you find that there are some regional economic blocks in the continent that have a competition regulation authority in place. So you have COMESA that has one, you have EAC and ECOWAS. And then you have SADC that has a voluntary model, so which involves commitment by the different member states to adopt national level competition laws and also just cooperate with one another when it comes to enforcement. So now, this one's yes. So now, the problem comes in, for example, when you have a country, maybe say Kenya, that has the Competition Authority of Kenya at the national level, and then you have COMESA, which also has a competition authority at now the regional level. And then now in the event that there's any conflict when it comes to different principles, then it brings some sort of chaos into which, for example, which one does Kenya go with? Do they go with, the national, do they go with the national or do they go with the regional one? So now AfCFTA, when it comes to full implementation, they will really have to think about having a harmonized competition policy. And then some of the challenges that actually affect some of these competition authorities is that number one is that you have the fact that most of them do not engage in matters of cross-border international anti-competitive practices. Only COMESA actually does at the moment, and yet you find that globally today, trade is just not about domestic markets. So production is usually across regional, or it can be like you have global value chains, you have the regional value chains. So therefore, what does it mean when you have this anti-competitive practices that are beyond the African market? And then the second thing is the disparity between trade objectives and also regulatory realities. So for example, if trade is supposed to increase economic welfare for Africans, then we really have to think about the theft of consumer surplus by anti-competitive needs and address them robustly. And then the third, again, just goes back to, the absence of competition law enforcement bodies or agencies, whereby you have more than 54% of AU members not having any form of competition authority. And even if it exists, you find that there's inadequate capacity, to investigate and also prosecute these cases. And there's also the aspect of inadequate resources. So now looking at this table, what we did now, I want to talk about the analysis of the main regional blocks. So what we did is we looked at various factors, which is there, the ticks generally just mean that for dispute resolution mechanism, does COMESA have it? Yes. Does AC have it? Yes, like that. So the main difference that we found was when it comes to subsidies or state aid, COMESA did not have any provision for that. But even though they all have these provisions, they do vary. So for example, when you examine the scope of objectives of these regulations, so COMESA, EAC, SADC, ECOWAS, you find that they are all designed in a way to encourage competition by preventing restrictive business practices, agreements such as mergers and acquisitions, and also just deterring aspects that might affect the efficient operation of markets. So some have all of those in their agreements, some have aspects of that, but in cumulatively, that's what all of them were trying to address. Then you have some that have explicitly articles that are on consumer welfare, others do not have. And then all these recs also had some sort of exclusions aside from the SADC block, so that you find that these exclusions, they range from aspects that deal with labor issues or treaties approved by the development bloc, or agreements and practices approved by the different competition authorities, or sometimes there were even aspects to do with activities of professional bodies, so such as collective bargaining, or either on behalf of employers or even employees, or enforce certain professional standards. So those ones were excluded in the different agreements, but then you have different ones excluding different things. And then also now you have, when it comes to regulators, so yes, they do have competition authorities, but this different responsibilities. So if you look at the EAC Competition Authority, it has exclusive right to determine violations under its regional block. So this goes to show that if, for example, there's that the national competition authorities in these partner states, they don't have jurisdiction to make a determination or finding based on the East African Competition Act. So in this case, the EAC Competition Authority has the full mandate and the full, like it's on top of now the national ones. Like Kenya is under the EAC, and also it's under and also can also for the Kenya Competition Authority of Kenya. So therefore, the EAC in this case has the mandate and not CAK. Okay, and then now you find that we also looked at the income competition laws have fines in them. So if you look at the COMESA competition regulation, they did not provide for any criminal sanction for the violations mentioned. But then now when you look at the COMESA competition rules, in that case they also highlight cases of abuse of dominance and all that, but they don't highlight the violations. Now, challenges affecting trade and fair competition in Africa. So the first challenge is existence of cartels, and how we defined cartels was that it's a formal agreement among farms, producers, and countries in an oligopolistic industry to agree among themselves prices, total output, market shares, and division of profits. Now, cartels are very harmful because they affect production, output, and also they create barriers of entry. so that if I'm a new entrant in a particular market and you have all these collusions between already existing firms, then it becomes very hard for me to come in and probably even have an influence in a small percentage of the market share. So you have countries like South Africa that have a leniency program, so whereby they try as much as possible to encourage reporting of cartels or any other anti-competitive practices. And leniency is just basically where you have a total or partial reduction of fines or any other penalties that is granted by these competition authorities to companies who are involved. So usually they try as much as possible. It applies mostly when there are secret cartels in a certain value chain, or just to deter companies from engaging in such behaviors. And then the second one is now infrastructure and technology. So technology usually contributes to the facilitation of trade by offering new ways of exchanging information and transacting businesses. So in Africa, power is by far the largest, 30 countries out of 54 facing regular power strategic premiums for emergency power. And this you can also even see it in our country today in Kenya, so whereby there are quite regular power shortages, and then we pay quite high premiums for emergency power. And then the third is lack of clear mechanisms to integrate agencies and policies. So there's a lot of inconsistency at the macroeconomic level in different countries. And this is, it could actually be a source of problem for systematic implementation of the regional integration agenda. So it's impossible to integrate regionally where there have been continuously glaring policy implementation and information. Now, let's look at, for example, tax policies. So there's a difference in domestic taxes. So if you look at Kenya, we have a VAT of 16%, and then you look at Uganda and also Rwanda, they charge 18% for VAT. And then now when you look at the export processing zones, now in Kenya and Tanzania, you find that they're exempted from, like for 10 years, they don't pay any income or withholding tax. But now, when you go to Uganda, that is not the case. So these trade agencies have to work together to be able to integrate some of these policies in place. And then the fourth one is institutional challenges. So you find that these regional institutions are not as independent as we would like them to be, because they have a lot of influence from their political leaders, who usually want to pass on their own agendas because they have personal interests at heart. And sometimes maybe you'd find there's a good leader in place and he implements some of these things that the different agreements want. But then once he leaves power, then it's not uncommon for all these efforts to go down the drain. And then the fifth is the lack of funds. So when you look at the International Monetary Fund, it says that African states need about 10 billion euros to pay off all foreign debts due to 2023. And then when you look also at the AU, African Union, currently they depend a lot on donor funding. So they have two sources of funding. They have from the member states and also donor funding, but they depend heavily on donor funding to be able to run its programs and operations, because about 40% of its members don't end up paying these annual fees that they're expected to pay. So that lack of funds then will have a huge impact on whether all these things that we're talking about can be implemented. And then the sixth is the uneven benefits of integration. So whereby you have 54 countries and all of them at different levels when it comes to economic development. And therefore there are those who probably, because they have more economic power, may tend to to benefit or reap more benefits compared to, the so-called weaker ones. So that's also a challenge. And then the last one is the existence of natural monopolies. So how we defined natural monopolies is the fact that they can occur as a result of the economies of scale or the sunk costs needed to operate in such an industry. But then now you have the African governments, most of them keep bailing out these natural monopolies every time they're running losses. I'm sure you're aware, even the other day, the Kenyan government is already planning to bail out Kenya Airways and also Kenya Airways and Kenya Power, yes, from that. So those are just examples. And yet they could easily just, leave this to privatization, and therefore this could lead to expansion of markets and therefore more opportunities for people to contribute here. So, yes, I think I'll now hand it over back to Melody to talk about the competition framework proposals. Thanks.
Thanks, Fiona. When it comes to the framework proposals, based on the analysis made, there are 4 possible approaches that the member states in the African Union can take towards formulating competition regulation in terms of an authority and laws and also policies. So the first approach that can be taken is a formation of a supranational AfCFTA competition authority, which will deal with cross-border competition violations by companies operating in more than one country or region. This will enable them not to handle every other dispute resolution in individual member states, and therefore give them more opportunities to look at competition regulation at the continental level. Therefore, it will give them there'll be more consensus when we have just a supranational authority that looks at cross-border competition violations only by companies operating in one region rather than looking at the individual member states' competition issues. Then the second approach is formation of a network of regional competition authorities. This will be very easy because so far from the 4 recs that we have analyzed, you've seen they have some form of regulation, authorities or policies in place. Therefore, if the recs come together and negotiate and form a network that will help them come up with competition regulation, it will make the work easier in the second phase of negotiations, and also this may also lead to the formation of the continental-wide competition authority framework. Another one is another approach that can be taken is fostering growth of national competition policies and agencies, and then encouraging a continental association or comparison framework of these institutions. So as we saw, there are a number of countries that already have authorities and the laws in place. There are some that only have a policy in place, others have none. But if each country is encouraged to have a competition authority whereby they settle on the little issue that may come up at the national level, it will be easier now for the national competition authority to come together and form a continental-wide framework. Then the last approach that we saw is having both frameworks with a sequential approach. That is whereby the process will start from creation of a continental association. This could be maybe in terms of recs coming together, or the national association, national competition authorities coming together, as on the side preparations of the establishment of a directorate authority within AfCFTA secretariat are finalized. So these are the easier approaches towards forming a continent-wide competition framework. Thank you so much for listening to us. You can find this research on Sage Journal's Antitrust Bulletin, and the link is provided there. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Fiona and Melody. So let me just try and sum up before I come for the questions and answers. I haven't seen any questions in the chat box, so I hope everybody was listening and taking notes, but let me try and say what I had. So I think the first thing that we had was basically a state of play to tell us that, yes, there's the African Continental Free Trade Area. Part of the expectation is that there'll be consolidation or at least a formation of institutions and regulations regarding competition law and competition policy. And secondly, we've heard about the fact that, look, it's not starting from a clean slate because there are regional economic blocks and those regional economic communities, and they're the basis of building the African Continental Free Trade Area, and therefore as well the basis for building a coherent competition policy and competition law that will apply. There are institutions in each of those regional economic blocks, regional economic communities, and there are different levels, and they also emphasize different things and different methods for dealing with competition policy challenges. And that's understandable because most of them are built on the context of country level and what most the regulators and the governors of those countries consider the biggest problems in international, in regional, trade, but also more importantly on competition policy. I think then we spoke about some challenges that exist. One of those, of course, is challenges of cartelizations on cartels. My colleagues chose a very formal definition, which is basically a formal agreement. I think cartels can exist in very silent forms. The economics literature tells us that in some ways cartels exist in some very sophisticated and very informal requests. So if the law thinks about it in terms of formal cartels, then the ability of its scope and its reach is something perhaps there's research to be undertaken and to be fed into the discussions that are coming. Then the problems, among those other problems, of course, that with every country there's collusion, there's a possibility of cartelization, of course, on collusion, the other anti-competitive behaviors and practices that do take place, but more importantly, obviously, also the question of natural monopoly. Now, natural monopoly, again, is an area in which the economics literature, there are some economists, especially the neoclassical economists who argue that the concept of a natural monopoly, as earlier defined, does not exist anymore, that monopolies exist. What we call monopolies might exist by virtue of the competition, or rather, the requirements of a sector. And so that natural monopoly, as was considered, was mostly a political a political view or classification. So for instance, power distribution was once considered, generation and distribution in this country and many other parts of this continent were considered national monopolies. I think it's not. So the idea of what actually constitutes a natural monopoly is itself one for great economics, not only research, but also great dispute. And what then constitutes natural monopoly becomes a very, very small part, but important nevertheless, of the economy and how you bear apply the tools of economics analysis of competition analysis to inform policy becomes an interesting one. So in my view, what my colleagues are saying is that yes, this is a new area of I think the justification exists for a competition policy that goes beyond borders. However, it has to be built from the ingredients of these. It has to be built from the ingredients of existing institutions, mechanisms, and obviously those approaches as well over time. And their institutions, tribunals do exist as well. I think at the COMESA, tribunals exist. They have different ways of actually responding to infringements of the competition law and competition policy. But all that puts us in an area in which the role and the significance of competition policy and competition regulation, I think, remains important. How we navigate those different systems is, I think, is an issue for research. That's the conclusion that I see. I see that in the link box, Dr. Karingi has shared a chapter 5 of a publication by UNECA, in which I think the title chapter is Assessing Regional Integration in Africa. That's a good thing. It would be a good one, I think. I haven't read it myself, but it's a good one because it presents it here. It's possible that it might inform this discussion going forward. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to open up to any questions that any of us might have. And I see Dr. Karingi's hand is up. So I'll ask him to ask his question. Dr. Karingi, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Kwame. It's always nice to attend these sessions of IEA. Thank you so much, Melody and Fiona, for the comprehensive presentation that you've given to us. Really, really interesting. Yes, I've shared in the chat box some work we did on the next steps after the AfCFTA was signed. And I can come back on everything else that we've been doing. But let me focus on the topic for today, and to say that I think the presentation was actually quite comprehensive. It has covered a lot of things, and I wanted to make 2 points which I think we could use the competition policy and the other phase 2 issues to advance the functioning of the regional integration within the continent. And maybe I would like to hear what Melody and Fiona, or even any other person, thinks about this. The first point is to say, would it be possible for Africa to think of using the competition policy regime to open up the public procurement market? As you know, at the WTO, we have the Government Procurement Agreement, the GPA. I'm not aware of any African country that's a signatory to that, but I could be corrected. But is it possible for us to think of using the competition policy protocol under the phase 2 issues of the AfCFTA to open up the public procurement market for within the continent? And you can see why this would be important. It would allow us to build African champions, because at least maybe they would have scale to be able to build their capacity, and of course learn from the other markets. And it's also going to help in the harmonization of standards in the way the public investments are done. So that's the first point I would want to put on the table, because if competition policy is about having a market that is fair and transparent for all, would this be an opportunity for us to open up the public procurement market? Now, the second point is to say that, so of course, trade and investment are two sides of the same coin. And it so happens that investment policy is one of those protocols that is going to be negotiated under the phase 2. So what we are trying to argue, at least here at the Economic Commission for Africa, is that we should actually use the investment protocol negotiations, investment policy protocol negotiations, as an entry point to deal with these other behind the border issues like competition policy, intellectual property rights, and the phase 3 issue of e-commerce. Because you would agree with me that you can have an investment protocol that actually undermines the competition. So you might come to negotiate a competition policy, but if you do not consider the linkages between investment policy and competition policy, they might work at cross purposes, or we may end up with a common investment area that is not optimal, because some of the articles or within the investment protocol undermine the realization of a working competition policy. So those are two things that I wanted to put on the table now that I'm speaking to researchers, and what you think about that. Thank you very much, Kwame.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karingi. I don't know. Let me just go fast to questions, because I haven't seen any other hands up. So let me just first ask. Let me ask Fiona and Melody to respond to your two questions. I hope you took them down. I have them, but I think just to save time, I'll ask them to respond, and then we'll go to other questions. Fiona and Melody, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Karingi, for your comments. And I'd want to agree with you that it's necessary for the investment policy to be negotiated together, or even be used as an instrument of negotiating the competition policy protocol. Since from our presentation, we've seen that trade policy trade liberalization, regulatory reform, investments, all these go hand in hand. So if we concentrate on one, there's a possibility of not looking at not putting so much. Okay, let me put it this way: putting so much emphasis on one might lead to other conflicts or issues ahead. Therefore, it is very necessary and also very prudent to have these negotiations happening at the same time, so that even as we open up the markets, as we have the deregulation taking place, these other investments and also investments and competition are also in place. These other policies are also in place so that we can have the actual a good environment where enterprises can thrive. And I do agree with your sentiments on both. Maybe I'd ask my colleague Fiona to add if she has anything.
Maybe for me, I'll just address the comment on whether it's possible for Africa to think of using the competition regime to open up the public procurement market. So, like, if you look at EU, they do have a set of minimum harmonized public procurement rules. So I think, yes, it is actually, we can also try and adopt such a public procurement system as well. So I don't know if that's what you meant by public procurement market, in which now you have all those rules that are coming to govern the way our governments are able to look at how they purchase goods and maybe services. Then yes, I think we can actually use this to be able to come up with such rules. Yeah, I agree.
All right, thanks Fiona and Melody. Are there any other questions? I haven't seen any questions in the chat box. Does anyone else have any questions, please? I see that anyone else with questions? Okay, well, let me add my comment to the question about opening up public procurement. I think that public procurement is one area in which African governments, I mean, let me say all governments globally, tend to be very protective. I think even Kenya's public procurement laws, or rather, sorry, Kenya's competition law actually provides an exemption to public procurement and some levels of public procurement as outside the domain of competition law. And so what one reads from that is that the intention of Parliament, if we may state so, was to make sure that competition only applies in the private domain. And so the rules of competition and the concerns are not necessarily imposed on the entire economy and public procurement. And that's, of course, a loss. We might understand what the political economy considerations are, but I think that's a loss because public procurement in Kenya is huge, and it's an area in which the potential to actually manage it well and use competition can actually create huge welfare gains for the country. Now, that's not to say that public procurement is lacking in competition principles, but mostly it's handled through public procurement laws, which themselves do not intersect perfectly with the competition law. So the commissioner, Director General of the Competition Authority, has jurisdiction on public on competition laws, cartelization, collusion, even consumer interests, but that does not extend to the public sector. Why it is designed in that way, I'm not too sure, but basically I think what government wishes to do is to maintain autonomy so that it can apply even affirmative action rules such as the access to government procurement law, which allows government procurement to be set aside and competition to be restrained or reduced so that disadvantaged groups or through affirmative action may actually work. Whether those are effective or not is a different matter, but I think I forget the specific part. It used to be chapter 5. I mean, sorry, it used to be article 5, section 5. but there is an obvious exemption of public procurement in Kenya to the competition regime. And I suspect that might be the same for other East African community nations. It would be a good one actually it's a good research area to actually find out what's the state of affairs regarding public procurement, because opening up public procurement would generate exceptional opportunities for welfare enhancement, especially in bigger markets. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, I see a question from Judith. Judith, would you like to ask your question, or should I just read it out for you? Judith Nguli?
Hi, my internet is not so good, so you can read it up for me.
Well, though I could hear you very clearly, but let me just read it out. So Judith Nguli asks, I can clarify the above. Has the team thought through how an integrated competition framework would look like, given that they are highly unequal? Basically, talking about the fact that there's asymmetry in the levels of competition compliance and also the rules that apply. As Fiona and Melody, have you thought about how an integrated framework would work? I think that's a really, really important question. Please go ahead, Fiona and Melody.
Okay, based on our analysis, what we saw as the best approach to having an integrated framework is having the RECs, having the supranational competition law forming from the basis of the foundations that have been set by RECs. This is because RECs have already negotiated with individual members, and they know what it means to work with different countries. They know what it means to have different laws and different competition authorities, and bringing that together and harmonizing to have a regional competition framework. Therefore, building a continental-wide integrated framework from the RECs will be easier than having individual member states coming to the negotiation table, knowing that we have different interests. There are some countries that big economies that would want to protect their industries. They wouldn't want competition. But when we look at it in terms of RECs, which have been there before having negotiated with these countries, having had to harmonize the different laws, the different regulations, it would be easier for them to sit at the negotiation table and develop an integrated framework for the continent. That would be my opinion on that. Maybe my colleague? Okay.
Fiona, do you have any comment?
No.
Okay. Fine. I see another question from Dr. Karingi. He says that beyond Kenya, state aid and exemption of the application of competition law could exist. And so we can use the AfCFTA protocol to deal with this, but I am satisfied with the take by Fiona, Melody, and Khan. Thanks a lot, Dr. Karingi. Okay, well, we're about to conclude, and I'd like to see whether there are any other questions. I do not see any other questions. So unless any one of you has any further questions, I'd like to get back to Fiona and Melody. This time I'll reverse I'll revise the order, and I'll ask Fiona and Melody to make any final comments, but also at the same time tell us where we go from here in terms of what other areas of research will you be pursuing. And yes, Judith Nguli says that the paper is behind a paywall. Unfortunately, Judith, yes, when you submit papers, sometimes that is what happens. But it's available behind a paywall, yes. But so we apologize for that. If you have access, I think you can find it. Melody and Fiona. Fiona, any final comments on where you think the next area of research would be?
Thank you so much, Kwame. So our next area of research, we're looking into economic integration. So we're still thinking about what exactly to address in that area. And then Thank you so much, Judith, also for your comments. So I think we'll look further into that integrated competition framework. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for your time and also for listening to us as we presented our paper. Thank you for those who made comments. Thank you, Dr. Karigi, and also Judith for your contribution. Being in the Trade Department, we have a lot of bilateral trade agreements going on. So we'll have to look at these bilateral trade agreements and how they integrate with multilateral trade issues like AfCFTA. How will the environment work with AfCFTA, and also having the different bilateral trade agreements that African member countries are negotiating with other partners. Thanks, and this presentation will be posted on our website, so you can get further information on that. Thank you.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here and attending this. Yes, we apologize due to that the paper is behind a paywall. I think that sometimes is one of the conditions. We'll try and make sure that we can find opportunities for publishing in the future in journals that would allow access. But I think that goes with this. I think many research institutions and colleges would be able to get you access. So if you're in a college or somewhere else, I think your librarian or somebody within the faculty or your department should be able to find you a copy. So that's the first thing. The second is, I'm glad and I'd like to thank my colleagues Melody and Fiona. Thank you very much for putting some work into this. I think the AfCFTA area is one that's spoken about quite a bit in the media. Taking research, especially homegrown research driven by Kenyan institutions, African institutions, and those in think tanks such as we, is an area that the IEA wants to at least increase the supply and the quality of the research regarding these areas by people from the countries that are affected, but also strengthening local voices in the discussions and also knowledge creation around these areas. So that's the deliberate choice that we are making. And we are glad that all of you support us by being here today. So I thank you all for the great discussion in my view. And once again, I congratulate my colleagues, Melody and Fiona, for the hard work that they put into this. So on behalf of the Institute of Economic Affairs, we are an institution with members, and if you'd like to be a member, please send us an email and we'll introduce you to the benefits, but also on how to join and to support the work that goes on here. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending this and for a good morning. The presentation will be available together with this recording. The presentation will be available on our website in the next 1 hour or so. And so if you'd like to look at it more clearly, more keenly, please do. And emails will be provided. And if you wish to have some correspondence with for comments or to clarify some things with Fiona and Melody, that too, you're welcome to. So once again, thank you very much and have a good morning. And we hope that you join us once again in another topical issue of this kind. Thank you very much and bye.